Hey guys. So today we're going to be talking about integrating outside material. We've talked a little bit about paraphrasing and well about plagiarism and about kind of the ratio that you need to have between quoting versus paraphrasing. Um, and some reasons why you would quote or need to quote and the times when you need to be paraphrasing material. And some problems people run into with like paraphrasing and working with sources and things like that in terms of plagiarism. That was the previous presentation, and now we're kind of picking up and picking back off of that, picking back off of that, and kind of thinking about once you are thinking about putting quotes and paraphrases and you have a handle on that into your paper, how to put them in clearly with enough like context to build your credibility, to build clarity, and to fulfill some of those requirements and expectations for academic writing in terms of explaining and analyzing and commenting on your sources. So we're going to start with our first thing, which is kind of going over the frame that you need to have. And again, what we're going to be going over is not necessarily a formula, but it is kind of a frame of mind that you need to have for how to build a frame around, especially quoted material, when you pull it into your paper. And we're going to start with the reasoning for that frame. The main thing that this helps with is not having dangling or hit and run quotes. Which are things like when quotes just sort of happen in the paper. That there's nothing that you've said to set it up before it, nothing after it. The quote is just there. And you may have heard like not to start or end a paragraph with a quote. That's not necessarily something you can't do, but it does, if you're not practiced with this, then it does increase the chances that you're going to have a dangling or a hit and run quote. And it's just sort of that point where readers are confused because they don't know why this is someone else speaking in your paper and we don't know why or where it's coming from. And it's very disruptive to the flow of ideas, and it's a little bit confusing. It's sort of like if I were, in front of the class giving a presentation about integrating outside material and I had someone from the Writing Center come in, but I didn't tell you that they were coming. They just sort of walked into class and started talking. You would be super confused. You would be like leaning over to people, whispering, probably like, why are we doing this? Who is this person? Where are they from? Is there going to be a quiz? Is she sending us to the Writing Center? What is happening? All of those questions, valid and pertaining to context I should have given you before I had this person come in and start speaking. And then assuming she just left the room and I just picked up where I left off and didn't say anything about her quick like talk or presentation. So you don't even know what you're supposed to take away from it. So assuming that like you're reading and communicating with this text that you're writing, it follows kind of the same kind of rule. Like when you have other people just jumping in and diving in your paper and speaking and we don't know where it's coming from, it creates that same effect. So this is sort of the formula for the frame, is to make sure you're introducing and giving context to important paraphrases, and it's always quotes, like especially quotes. The only time you might not need much of a frame for a quote is if again you're re-quoting from the same source again. You might not necessarily need to give as much context for it if we already know the source. But the first time you quote from any source in a paper, you should always provide or using a source for evidence or using it as something important. You should always introduce it the first time. And again, from there, you can kind of give us a little bit less because assuming that we've already been introduced to this source, so we already kind of know. But again, like introducing, giving context for the quote, including the quote, and then explaining the quote. Explaining the quote is what's really hard. That's where you have to tell us what we're supposed to take away from it, how it proves the point, provide commentary on it, explain to us what it means and what it shows. And a lot of times we leave this part out, and we'll get into more of that later, but introducing it, giving context, giving the actual quote, and then explaining it. And again, it's not necessarily a formula that you have to do it in this order. It can be, once you get good at it, you can kind of play around with it. Sometimes we explain things before we quote it. But it does kind of create a habit of mind of knowing like these are things you should be including with quoted material. I'm going to start with kind of breaking down the introducing part of the formula. So we're gonna go with me on this. I used to use the metaphor that being a good host with your paper was like hosting a party. So writing a paper does not feel like a party. We're gonna go with event because it's a little bit more vague. So when you're introducing material, you need to be a good host. When you are writing a paper, you are essentially hosting an event. Writing is social. There are readers involved. There are sources involved. This is a social event. It's your responsibility to make sure that everything is clear, that everybody knows everybody. Just like you would at an event, you would be in charge. You're the star, but you're also in charge of making sure everybody knows why everybody is here. Your readers are your guests, your sources are your invited guests or speakers, and of course if you were having someone speak, stand up to speak to the room, you would introduce them first and explain who they are and why they're there. Same concept in a paper. It's the same sort of social principles and basic kind of sense of how to communicate with a lot of people. Your readers haven't done your research. They need to know who your sources are and why they should trust them. So just remember that you're the mediator, you're the host, you're the one who's supposed to be in control. And part of that is providing clarity and making sure everybody knows everybody. And to make sure that you're being a good host, that you're being fair to everybody. So if you had speakers at your event that you didn't necessarily agree with, you would still introduce them fairly and courteously. And so being careful of your tone, and because you want to appear fair-minded and responsible. And you want to invite curiosity, but not confusion. So you want people to maybe want to know more about things and want to explore them on their own, but you don't want them to have to leave your paper because they're confused about something. So if you're quoting from this documentary and you didn't introduce it and tell us anything about what the documentary was about, your reader might have to go and Google that documentary to read a summary of it because you didn't provide one. That would be them leaving out of confusion, not curiosity. So you want to make sure that you're providing enough that even if your readers haven't read these sources, even if they don't leave your paper, you're giving them enough context to follow what you're talking about. So some things you might include are where the material is from. So again, these are things you've prepared for because you're going to be using hopefully some things from your annotated bibliography, and you have information about those sources and authors pre-prepared. So author and publisher background, if it's relevant, if there's expertise, especially including expertise if you're using them as evidence or as an expert. General context or purpose, you might have to provide a statement about the author's perspective, overall perspective on a topic if you're using them to back you up on something. You might also maybe need to provide a summary of something, like a summary of a documentary or a quick summary of a book, something short. Specific context might be, if you're talking about a study, you would hopefully provide the conditions for that study because we're going to want some details for where those numbers and where that information came from. And also it might also be pulling from or explaining where, possibly if you're using a documentary and you've given a general summary, it might also be a setup for where in that documentary you're pulling information from. So, in this part of the documentary where they're interviewing so-and-so, and kind of giving us some more details. So those things might all be helping to provide some context for things. The next part is explaining the outside material. And again, this is the part that kind of gets left out. And it's the part where you're making sure the reader is understanding the information the same way you are. We said part of it being an academic argument, being fair, is not that you're trying to win at all costs or convince your reader at all costs, but that you're trying to get them to see why you interpret the information the way that you do, why you interpret the research that you've done the way that you do. So to create understanding for how you're seeing the research with your reader. And that's a great step in communicating clearly. And it is a way of using persuasion. It's not persuasion just getting people to change their minds about something, but to see how you see things and to understand where you're coming from. And it's a kind of argument, or the way you want to be approaching this argument. And part of that is making sure that you've explained why you're taking what you're taking from the data you have. And just kind of keeping in mind that this is where you connect the dots. So you have a point for this section and you have this piece of information. You need to explain how this data, this statistic, this quote from this expert helps support this point. readers are going to read things from our own experiences. Again, you've watched the news. You know that two different news sources from two different political slants can use the exact same recording, the exact same statistic, and interpret it wildly differently. Same thing. Just because we see the same numbers and your readers are looking at the same graph you are, doesn't mean that they're noticing what you want them to notice. Or that they even understand how to read it. They're going to bring their own experiences, values, and knowledge. They're going to read differently. They might not infer the same things that you do. So you want to be really careful about making sure you're explaining your data well and from your perspective. I don't know if you've ever done creative writing classes before, but one of the concepts that they teach is to show, not to tell. So for example, to not write like she cried, but to say tears streamed down her cheeks because you have now shown the reader and helped them visualize what you've said. You didn't have to tell it. Academic writing is a little bit trickier because we want you to show and tell. We want you to show us the quote, show us the image, show us the graph, show us the data, and then tell us about it. That's what the explanation part is. It's where you have shown us the thing, but now you're going to talk about it and tell us what you want to take away from it. You're telling us how you want us, how you're reading it and interpreting it. You're telling us what you want us to see or realize or get from it. And it's also when I said, like, don't let your sources like talk for you. You should be able to pull out your quotes and pull out your data and it still makes sense. And if you are doing that, if you have context for this quote and you have explanation for it, we can still follow it. That's how it's done. The quotes are there to provide almost ways to show and support what you are already saying, but you have to say it first. You can't allow the quote to do it for you, and that's kind of where that comes in. And just kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about, should I quote or should I paraphrase? If you feel like this straight up does not need explanation or commentary, it's not worth quoting. This is what it might look like. Have the quote, and then it sounds a little bit like you're almost re-paraphrasing it with your own analysis. It sounds like you have the quote, and then it says like, basically this author is affirming, and then explaining like how it proves the point. In other words, this author believes. In other words, this graph argues or illustrates the essence of this person's argument, or even this picture or this graph. What it shows is this. So some of the questions you might want to think about when you're considering, what do I need to explain? Are there terms, language, or wording the reader doesn't understand? Remember, you don't want these lovely sounding, super disciplinary, specific quotes that your reader doesn't know what the heck to do with it or what it even means, because they might not be experts and they don't know what this language means. That's one of the reasons to paraphrase definitions. And if you really need this quote because it's the author's words and they're supporting you on something, explaining what it means after it. You want to think about, does it